Good morning, everybody. I apologize for all the technical difficulties that I had uh, on Sunday. Uh, Unfortunately, my computers, like myself, are getting old. Um, and we can't multitask the way we used to. Hopefully, by the time the next session comes around, I'll have a new computer and everything will be working fine and dandy. But in the meantime, I've decided to uh, record this talk so you can see it. So I am going to, incidentally, I am sitting in front of a picture of an actual library in Germany. And if I could, this is where I would live, right in the library. So I'm going to go to share my screen. Very good. Okay, this is session 7, which is a recapitulation of the first 6 sessions, but doing it with kind of a different spin and providing more in the way of her story than his story. The fact of the matter is that much of American Jewish history is presented as his story. In fact, much of history, period, is presented as his story because it's men who write the histories. Those who have power write the histories, which can be shown on the side of the slide here of the writers of history among men and among women. Now, Jewish history, first of all, in American Jewish history, at the outset, most of the migration was men. So it would definitely be his story. But over time, women came as well. Men occupied positions of power relative to women. And as I said, men have written most of the histories. Here are 3 books about women, Jewish women in America. I've read the one in the middle. It's excellent. And I came across the other 2. They are all, incidentally, either written or edited by women, and you can find more information from this particular website here. Now, the eras of American history from the colonial period to the end of the 19th century include the period of colonial settlement, the Revolution, the establishment of a new nation, and dare I say, the peaceful transition of power from one president to the next, national expansion, both geographically and economically, reform, Civil War and Reconstruction, and the rise of industrial America. There have been 3 basic eras of Jewish migration up through, let's say 1924, when immigration was decreased tremendously by American law. The first was the Sephardic. These were people, many of whom left the Netherlands, to which they had fled after being tossed out of either Spain in 1492 or Portugal in, I believe, 1497. Baruch Spinoza's family had left Portugal. and went to the Netherlands. This was followed by Central European immigration, mainly from the German states, Germany not being a single country until towards the end of the 19th century, 1870, 71. And there were two waves. There was the wave up to 1848 and the wave after 1848. And in 1848, there were a series of revolutions throughout Europe. Many Jews had supported revolution against the existing monarchies or princely states. And when the monarchies won out, some Jews fled. Before that, though, there were times of economic dislocation and despair, and people left Central Europe looking for a better place to live. There had been a particularly long couple of winters following a volcanic explosion, putting ash into the atmosphere, which ruined crops and caused food shortages and famine. After about 1880, the main migration was from Eastern Europe, particularly Russia and areas of Poland, some of which were controlled by Russia. And this was promoted by the not only economic necessity, but also the Tsarist pogroms. Well, by 1730, immigrants from Germany outnumbered immigrants from the Sepharad, but there just weren't that many Jews. I mean, by the time of the revolution, there are only about 2,500 total, and they lived primarily along the eastern seaboard. You can see some of the main areas of Jewish life where we have these little stars of David, and this is where there were synagogues. Okay, but they were up and down the eastern seaboard, which of course is where the colonies were. Jewish women in colonial North America occupied traditional roles within the Jewish community and traditional roles within the larger society. By and large, they couldn't serve in positions of leadership either in the Jewish community, in the synagogue, or the general community. At this time, they were not known to have had their own social organizations, and their primary occupation was that of homemaker, although some kept lodgings. Interestingly, the Jewish women in colonial South and Central America had tended to have bigger roles in the economy than they did in North America, although it's not entirely clear to me why that was the case. This is Abigail Levy. I'm going to tell you a little bit about her right now. Or, well, not right now, but marriage was a central life event. Jewish women at marriage aged about 23, men about 10 years older. Women tended to marry Jews. Men also tended to marry Jews, but were more likely, but were more likely than women to marry non-Jews. And it wasn't easy finding a partner because there just weren't that many Jews. So they had to look among Jewish communities elsewhere in North America, in the Caribbean and England. And so that marriage created these networks of personal ties that spanned the Atlantic world. For women, it was also a life of disruption. Uh, they had generally had to move to their husband's community. Uh, Many of the husbands were merchants and they traveled, and sons were often posted to distant ports. So Abigail Levy was born in London of Jewish German immigrants. The family moved to New York City by 1695. It had been taken over by England. And in 1712, she got married to another London-born Jew, also of German origin, and they had 9 children. They were very active in New York's Jewish life. They belonged to the congregation, the first synagogue in North America. It was founded, well, they actually didn't have a synagogue until 1728. The congregation was founded in 1655, and they met in members' houses. What they did first, before they had a synagogue, 70 years before they had a synagogue, was to establish a Jewish cemetery. Abigail Levy was also active in broader Christian society, and she had many Christian friends. She raised her children as practicing Jews. Both daughters and sons received instruction in Hebrew. They kept kosher, kept Jewish holidays, but they never achieved the kind of financial stability that they had in England. And one by one, the children were sent to England in order to prosper. And it is very likely that Abigail never saw her adult children after they left, or any of her English grandchildren. And for the remainder of her life, they kept in contact by the exchange of letters. And 33 of her letters, all of them to her son Naphtali, have survived. In them, she urged Naphtali in England to keep up with his morning devotions and not to eat non-kosher food, and warned him off even his uncle's table. She was very well read. Her favorite authors were Alexander Pope, Fielding, Smollett, Dryden, Montesquieu, Addison, and Gentleman's Magazines, which were, kind of the main intellectual fare in England, and the books and magazines were supplied to her by her son. She was also very critical of much in Judaism, and she yearned for a Luther or a Calvin to reform what she deemed Judaism's worst superstitions, but she still followed all the practices. She was scathing in her critique of the New York Jewish community, calling its ladies a stupid set of people, and despairing about the pool of Jewish suitors available for her daughters. Another Jew, who lived during this time, was Abigail Minnis, and she was in the South. She and her husband and 2 daughters were among the first Jews to arrive in Savannah. Savannah being the capital, or the main town in the colony of Georgia that was founded by James Oglethorpe. Over the next 20 some odd years, she had 7 more children. She was widowed at age 56 and had 8 children to support. She went on to build a small fortune in land. And in 1763, she applied for a license to operate a tavern. And she and her daughters carried this on until 1779. And this became a main watering hole for the colony's elite, not only the Jews, but the non-Jews as well. And she was a very strong supporter of the Revolutionary War against England. Now, for the Jews in the hinterlands, first of all, there weren't that many, but the few that they were at this time, keeping a Jewish home was challenging. And one Rebecca Samuels, who with her watchmaker husband settled in rural Virginia, wrote to her parents in Germany, "The way we live here is not life at all. Jewishness is pushed aside. We do not know what the Sabbath and holidays are." Now, I have to tell you that why they needed a watchmaker in rural Virginia, I have no idea, but there you are. So few in number, concentrated mainly in the eastern seaboard and in the cities, Jews were an important part of the commercial and social life. And then came the revolution. Uh, Grace Nathan was a strong supporter of the revolution. She was born in Stratford, Connecticut. Her husband was a merchant and another patriot. Uh, She was a sister of literary, skilled, and learned men and began writing poetry as a young woman and continued to do this until her death, although none of her work was published during her lifetime. And this is one of her poems, which you can read at your leisure, but I found it quite moving, quite moving. Within those walls made sacred to the dead, where yet no spade has rudely turned a sod, no requiem chanted for a spirit fled, no prayer been offered to the throne of God. Anyway, she was a pretty good poet. Now, among the most famous Jews of early America was Rebecca Gratz, who I talked about in a previous lecture, but it's worth repeating to those who've heard it and worth hearing about it by those who haven't heard it yet. She was born in Pennsylvania, German Jewish extraction. She never married, although she received many offers. Apparently, she received an offer from a Gentile whom she loved but decided not to marry. She was famous for a couple of things. The first is that she played a huge role in getting women to do so-called good works. And she helped establish the Female Association for the Relief of Women and Children in Reduced Circumstances, which helped women whose families were suffering after the American Revolutionary War. And casualties and damage in the American Revolution were very, very high. In 1815, after seeing the need for an institution for orphans in Philadelphia, where she had moved, she was instrumental in founding the Philadelphia Orphan Asylum. She was among the founders of the Female Hebrew Benevolence Society. Big supporter of social services. And this social services organization was created by a group of women from Congregation Mikveh Israel to support Jewish women who found themselves in bad circumstances for whatever reason. And if that weren't enough, she started a Hebrew Sunday school, the first of its kind in America. And this was in 1838. She became the superintendent and the president and assisted in developing its curriculum. But she was also famous in another way, because Washington Irving was a close friend of the Gratz family, and she knew Sir Walter Scott and Rebecca Gratz. And Rebecca Gratz was close to Irving's fiancée, who had died of consumption or tuberculosis. Well, Irving went to Scotland and visited Walter Scott and described her wonderful beauty and related the story of her firm adherence to a religious faith under the most trying of circumstances. And she became the model for Rebecca in Walter Scott's novel Ivanhoe, who loves Lancelot but will not marry him. Now, after the Revolution, America expanded tremendously in size. Uh, First, from the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Revolutionary War, America, or the United States, went basically as far as the Mississippi River. Okay, although there weren't states over here yet. Florida was added. Different parts of the Gulf Coast were added. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803, because Napoleon needed the money because he was being bled white by the Peninsula War, which was his attempt to conquer Spain, and so on. Territory was one thing, but you had to get to that territory. And during this period after the Revolution, turnpikes and canals were built, and eventually railroads. And that's how people got, you can see there's Cleveland over here, and Erie, and Sandusky. Cincinnati became a big town, Louisville, and basically anywhere there's a railroad station, there are Jews. And these were also the beginning paths for the main occupation of new immigrants, which was peddling, being merchants on the road, and they filled the spaces in between the lines. Now, in the Civil War, Jewish women, like their Gentile neighbors, like their husbands, were on both sides. If you lived in the South, you were more likely to support the South. If you lived in the North, you were more likely to support the North. There were Jews in the South who owned slaves, not out of proportion to the population as a whole, and the number of slaves they tended to have was small, mostly household slaves. On both sides of the Mason-Dixon line, they kept the home fires burning. They had to take care of things when their husbands were in the army. They made new female benevolent associations. The Jews of Washington, D.C. placed an appeal to the Jewish Messenger, a newspaper in New York, in which they noted, unlike you in New York, we have no fund to support the families of poor soldiers. And the unhappy consequence is the wives and the children of these poor men are in abject want, and Jews from New York sent money to Washington. Simon Wolf. So what did they do at home? They raised money. Simon Wolf reported about a fair that the Hebrew societies had a table at, and they got $756, and the entire receipts were, 10 grand, all honor to our fair Jewesses. In Philadelphia, the congregation that Rebecca Gratz had belonged to, Mikveh Israel, turned the synagogue into a hospital. And the various Jewish women's societies started producing uniforms for men in the Union Army. And as I mentioned early in a previous lecture, that many of the uniforms in the Union Army were very, very badly made. They were made using a material that was called shoddy, which was kind of leftover stuff. And that term came to mean what it means today, like shoddy merchandise, basically crap. Women in various cities in the North and in the South founded, soldiers' aid societies. a couple of women of the Confederacy, uh, the Levy sisters. Eugenia was a spy, and she was jailed twice for it. Uh, and her sister, Phoebe, was a nurse, and she she made her mark by feeding the wounded with her chicken soup. And I think this kind of sums it up, that they did the best they could, and they had to accept bravely all that was left. And they were on the losing side. So women had two roles. They had work, which was much of which was at home, and good works. But as Eastern European immigration began, and the numbers began to increase dramatically, women had to find work. And where did they work? In the rag trade. Jews had been peddlers in the rag trade. Many of them had been tailors. My own grandfather, who came over somewhere around 1900 or so, had been apprenticed to a tailor before he came to America. And they were in the rag trade making clothes. And first they worked at home in home sweatshops, and then in factories. And you'll notice that nothing wrong with child labor here. Everyone was making clothes, and it was all piecework. It was not by the hour, it was by the piece. Now, the attitude of the American Jewish community, which was basically the German American Jewish community towards Eastern European immigration, included a lot of resentment, because German Jews were mostly Reform now, and were reasonably well off, or at least as well off as everybody else in America. And they looked down on these Eastern European immigrants who came to America with basically nothing. But that wasn't the only part of their attitude. The other part of their attitude was in social activism to contribute to the welfare, protection, and education of these new immigrants. They founded the Hebrew Immigrants Aid Society of New York, and they agitated for mission work among the tenements. These were the apartment buildings which were really rat traps and death traps where people lived. And in this social activism, there was a major, major role for Jewish women. So I'm going to tell you about one Jewish woman by the name of Lillian Wald. I really didn't know anything about her until I read that book that I mentioned in the second slide, I think. She was born in Cincinnati, the third of four children, German Jewish extraction. Her family had left after the 1848 revolutions. In 1878, they moved to Rochester, New York, where she considered this to be her hometown. She was educated at an English-French boarding school and was excellent in science, math, and the arts. And her family was a member of the Reform Temple, but she received no formal Jewish training. At 16, she applied to Vassar, but was refused because she was too young. Well, soon thereafter, she attended the birth of her sister Julia's child, and was so inspired by the work of the attending nurse that she decided to become a nurse herself, and she enrolled at the New York Hospital Training School. Now, the New York Hospital at this time was in the forefront of the medical field. It adopted practices like sterilizing sheets, and surgical instruments and applying disinfectants to the hands of hospital staff. And heavens to Murgatroyd, staff also used masks during operations. The hospital instituted a Florence Nightingale-inspired nurse training program a few months after the hospital opened in 1877. And there it is. And different parts of the hospital, a ward, place where people could do some exercise, get some fresh air. And this is Lillian Wald. This is a children's surgical ward at now Bellevue Hospital. She graduated in 1891. She started work at a juvenile asylum and an orphanage, but she quickly became disillusioned with institutional methods. This is what the Lower East Side, where she lived, looked like. This is Remington Street. I've been there. So she decided to go to medical school. So she enrolled in Women's Medical College in New York City, but found that medicine was too focused on physiology and not enough on people. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Same thing. So she left, same thing today. She left medical school, and in 1893, she agreed to teach a class in home nursing and hygiene to immigrant women on the Lower East Side, like this area, and she loved it. She absolutely loved it, and that became her life's work. One day she was teaching a child, and the little girl asked her to, please look at her sick mother at home, and the child led her through these tenements over broken roadways between tall reeking houses. In England, these kinds of tenements were called rookeries. They were so packed with people and garbage, and it was really awful. And walked up the rear of a tenement by slimy steps and finally to the sick room. And Wald decided to dedicate her life's work to the tenement community. She wrote that this was a baptism of fire. Deserted were the laboratory and academic work of college. I'd never return to them. I rejoiced that I had training in the care of the sick that in itself would give me an organic relationship to the neighborhood in which this awakening had come. She practiced community nursing. She even coined the term public health nurse in 1893 for the nurses who worked outside hospitals in poor and middle-class communities. She and a friend established the visiting nurse service. And you can see here, these are tenements. Of course, there's no air conditioning. And if you've been in New York in the summer, it's pretty awful without air conditioning. And people would sleep outside to the degree that they could. She founded a place that could organize all this, called the Henry Street Settlement. And there it is. It was based on the principle that everyone should have access to health care. Can you imagine? What an idea. It provided preventive care, health education, home care that reduced hospital time. It's only about 100 years before its time. Care for children during a parent's hospitalization, and social programs. Here are Lillian Wald and her friend Mary Brewster. And there are some of the visiting nurses. And they could have just as easily had the same or a very similar motto as the U.S. Post Office. Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night shall stay these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. Except these couriers were carrying medical instruments and knowledge. This is a very, very famous photo of a visiting nurse going from one apartment to another, and it was easier to cross by way of the roofs of the tenements than it was to go all the way downstairs, negotiate outside, and walk back upstairs. And here she's visiting nurse in a home, dealing with a baby. Here's another kid. This is not a wealthy place. So the Henry Street settlement provided healthcare, social services, classes in everything from English to music, infant care, cooking and sewing classes, dance classes. They built the first playground in New York City. There's a playground. I think this was a basket weaving class. A cooking class. And of course, if you're going to have a cooking class, you've got to have a cookbook. I think they even sold this cookbook to make some money. They taught how to set up a table. Okay, and here's a recipe if you want to make it. I haven't made this, but there you are. Matzo fruit fritters. She started a series of lectures to educate prospective nurses at Columbia University's Teachers College. And students attended classes at Columbia, and that they got field training at the Henry Street Settlement. And this led to the formation of the university's Department of Nursing and Health in 1910. I am a graduate of Columbia, both Columbia College and the medical school, so I'm pretty proud of this kind of stuff. She was also a political activist for both women's suffrage and racial justice. Her settlement houses not only provided services, but employed members of all racial and ethnic groups. She insisted that Henry Street's classes be racially integrated. And there was a branch of it in Harlem, I believe, known as the Lincoln House, which served the African American community. And it was known for its extensive research on the lives of Blacks. She was involved with the National Negro Conference, a gathering held at Henry Street. And the conference became the founding meeting of the NAACP. She joined with the NAACP in 1915 to protest the release of the film The Birth of a Nation, which celebrated the KKK in its belief in white supremacy. This was the very famous D.W. Griffith film. At the time of the convention, it was said it was too serious unless there was some social provision. So she suggested having a party at the house, but the organizing committee was fearful. Oh no, it won't do. As soon as white and colored people sit down and eat together, there begin to be newspaper stories about social equality. Heavens above. But she responded, but 200 members of the conference couldn't sit down. Our house is too small. Everyone would have to stand up for supper. And the party was successful. She participated in the New York State women's suffrage campaign. The task of organizing human happiness needs the active cooperation of man and woman. It cannot be relegated to one half of the world. Following World War I, there was a Red Scare. Well, following World War I and the Russian Revolution, there was a Red Scare, and she had been labeled radical. She was anti-war. She had endorsed socialist candidates. She was associated with people like Emma Goldman. She defended immigrant aliens, and even her neighborhood celebrated the success of the Russian Revolution. But following this, there was a real reaction on the part of the U.S. government, which was extremely anti-communist. Many people don't know that the U.S. invaded Russia after the revolution. She, in fact, accepted an invitation to go to see communist Russia for herself. And she supported the idea that the government should recognize Russia as a country, which it hadn't done so far. She was not a socialist, as far as I can tell, much less a communist, but she was radical in her own way. I think this is a wonderful quotation. Reform can be accomplished only when attitudes are changed. And this is where she's buried, in Mount Hope Cemetery. For enrichment, if you want to learn a little bit more, there's a lecture by Dr. Henry Abramson on YouTube. There's this website, thelillianwall.com, which has a ton of information about her life, and it's where I took a lot of this. This is my main source for this class, but I've also used these other books as well. And for reference later on, this is just a timeline that you could read at your leisure. I would like to thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to having my computer problems fixed by the next time. Till the next R Tent, have a good week. Bye-bye.